Hi everyone, welcome to our WVS webinar on the rise of antibiotic resistance in the veterinary field and how to combat it. We have one of our lovely vets, Dr. Anita, talking to us today, and so I'm just going to hand over to her now. Please enjoy.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Anaita, and today's webinar is dedicated to highlighting the globally important issue of antimicrobial resistance, especially as the period from 18th to 24th November is observed as Antimicrobial Resistance Awareness Week. So let's start with the webinar, and we are going to talk about the rise of antibiotic resistance in the veterinary field and how to combat it. So I think everyone knows the history, and we know Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, and he also won the Nobel Prize for it. But a very important thing is that he did caution that that antibiotics would lead to a bacterial backlash, and he was 100% right. So if you see the history, it shows you the year that the antibiotic was introduced and the year the resistance emerged. So some antibiotics, within a few years, 2 or 5 years, there is a resistance that has emerged. And usually before 1980s, they wouldn't develop new antibiotics because they were happy with penicillin. And because of because it was also affordable, they kept using it, and the bacteria developed defenses more quickly. They got adapted, and then the resistance developed. So you can see how quickly the resistance can develop. Now, whenever we treat an animal with antibiotics, we realize it's not working. And the reason why it's not working could be because of the drug bug mismatch. You could maybe use something different for something that is not going to help, and different dosages you'll have to calculate properly depending on body weight. Some drugs are supposed to be given intravenously, and if you give it subcutaneously, that reduces the efficacy. Duration, very important. So there are two important types of antibiotics. One is concentration dependent, one is time dependent. So depending on that, you'll have to select whether it has to be given twice a day or once a day. Then host immunity plays a very important part, and malnutrition also. Usually when an animal doesn't have enough nutrition, it can lead to reduced immunity. Very important thing we have to remember is antibiotics are not a replacement to immunity, but it just supports the animal's health during the animal facing a bacterial infection. So very important to correct the nutritional and immunity of the animal. And last but not the least is something that we are going to talk about is resistance, and that's why your antibiotic can fail. Now, how does bacteria become resistant is by mutation processes, by gene transfer, horizontal gene transfer. They exchange DNAs, and what it does, it can inactivate the drug with various mechanisms. Sometimes it can alter the target site where the drug is supposed to work. It can reduce the permeability, so the drug doesn't penetrate the host cell, the bacterial cell. And active removal of drugs. There's something called as efflux pumps. So this can just remove the antibiotic from the bacterial cell. So these are the ways that bacteria uses to become resistant. Now, where we are responsible as veterinarians, there are certain veterinary drivers of resistance. First is obviously the overuse. We have been using, we distribute antibiotics like candy sometimes, even for prophylaxis, and when it's not required. Very rarely, for certain surgical procedures, you do require a prophylactic dose of antibiotic, but not in other diseases. Incomplete dosing, very important. Again, this can be sometimes the veterinarian's fault, or it could be also because of the client not being vigilant and not being following the instructions given to them. Poor hygiene is something that we don't pay much attention to, but it's very, very important. And insufficient cleaning, sanitation, whether it's your clinic, or whether it's a hospital, whether it's a barn, it's a farmland, anywhere there, if there is poor hygiene, you're going to keep having infections. And obviously there'll be some bacteria which are resistant, and they're going to spread. The other problem in some countries would be there is easily you can just go and purchase antibiotics over the counter. There are no strict regulatory bodies, policies that kind of make sure the antibiotics are used properly. again, we have a lot of friends in the medical, medical reps, and they visit us often with samples that are given to us. So when they sometimes might give antibiotic samples out, we are forced to kind of just dispense them, and that can also be a bad thing. Another thing, something as simple as just displaying these higher antibiotics in the front row of your clinic just kind of makes you reach for it really easy. If it is somewhere at the back, you might only think of it when you're doing a culture, and then you realize you don't have that antibiotic in the front row, then you reach for the last row. So something really simple can might help in the future, but these are the reasons why there might be this resistance development. Now, talking about this, what are the consequences of antimicrobial resistance? It is obviously treatment failure, because your antibiotics are not going to work. There'll be increased mortality, a lot of deaths, because you're not able to cure the disease. Zoonotic spread, we'll be talking about that in just a bit, and increased cost for both for the veterinarian and for the client. So talking about zoonosis, antibiotic resistance is almost like a zoonotic disease. So we should worry about rabies, leptospirosis, but similarly antibiotic resistance is something that can spread across species. So if you have especially farm animals, and it's something like from farm to the table. So if you're consuming meat, if you're consuming some vegetables that have been exposed to these resistant bacteria, you can actually contract these resistant bacteria. Even contaminants in, like fomites or fecal matter, you can easily catch these resistant bacteria. And some of the most common resistant bacteria in the veterinary medicine is MRSA, there's MRSP, there is an E. coli, and there is multi-drug resistant Salmonella and Pseudomonas. So the most common one that we nowadays see is MRSP, methicillin resistant staph pseudo intermediates, and this is most commonly seen in skin infections or ear infection. So why is all this important? It's just to follow this one health policy, which recognizes that the health of people is connected to the health of animals and the environment. And because a recent survey that WHO did suggests that the resistance has risen over 40% between 2018 and 2023, which is really scary. And we have to use this antibiotic resource very, very carefully. Like you can see in the picture, there's a 10-year challenge where these are the antibiotic culture discs, and you can see the zone of inhibition, that is the transparent area, is wider in 2009, and then 10 years later you see there is no zone of inhibition. So that just means that the bacteria growing in the plate is completely resistant to all these antibiotics. Now, which antibiotics do you choose, which not to choose, highly depends on this categories that the antibiotics fall in. So we have WHO, who has categorized these antibiotics. So there is highest priority critically important antimicrobials, which you have to use very, very carefully. Then in the red zone, there is a critically important antibiotics. Then you move down to important antimicrobials, and then there are certain which are to be used only at the veterinary field. So it's a good thing that we are still in the green zone, and this is the time that we can actually stop the resistance from growing, and just by being vigilant. And we'll talk about how we are going to combat it. These are just examples of classes that you should not be using. So these are the highest priority critical. When you say priority, means it's not that you have to prioritize the antibiotic in a way to use it first, but you have to prioritize in a way that you have to save the antibiotic. You have to keep it as a last resort antibiotic. So drugs such as vancomycin should not be used in animals at all. And then we have a list of third, fourth generation cephalosporins. We have glycopeptides, macrolides, we have quinolones, and quinolones we have enrofloxacin, which again is very, very risky to use. And you have to only use it when you do a culture. Now in the column, you can also see there is something called as selective pressure. And selective pressure is created by antibiotics, where they kill the susceptible bacteria, allowing the resistant strains to survive and multiply. So these antibiotics, which are these critically important or high priority antibiotics, they have created they have created these resistant bacteria which are specifically resistant to those antibiotics. So it's a sad thing, but that is what is happening, like as you keep overusing the antibiotics. So remember the traffic signal: there is red, there's orange, there's green, and you always go for the first line of treatment, that is green, and you have to choose the first tier antibiotics. Now, these are just examples of which antibiotic you can use. It's a peer-reviewed paper, so you can see for most of the cases like urinary tract infections or respiratory infections, skin infections, you would want to choose something, in the first tier, which is amoxicillin or amoxicillin clavulinate. You can go for cephalexin, you can go for doxycycline, you can go for clindamycin sometimes, but these are the ones that you have to restrict to. Whereas in the second table, there is a second line or last resort drugs that are given, and you can see that second line there is azithromycin, there are cephalosporins, and the second and third generation there is fluoroquinolones. Now, fluoroquinolones initially, yes, was the second choice, but now because there is an emergence of resistance towards quinolones, it has been shifted as the last resort category. So please remember that it is not something that you can reach for at the first signs of infection. Then we come to how we are going to combat this antibiotic resistance is by following antibiotic stewardship. So what does this mean? It means that you have to ensure that you are having accurate diagnosis of what has happened and choose the right antibiotic. You have to decide whether it can penetrate the particular soft tissue or an organ and then decide to use it. Correct dose, route, duration. Then when it's unnecessary, try to avoid, and that is the best way you can actually prevent antibiotic resistance, is by not using an antibiotic in the first place. Then strengthen infection prevention and educate pet owners, very important. We're going to talk about how to deal with clients, and also promote responsible use in herd and production medicine. Again, farm animals, it's a whole different topic, but we don't have time for that. But following different things like withdrawal period and making sure that farm animals receive antibiotics only when required, not as growth promoters, it's very, very important. So we have something called as a no antibiotic prescription form, which can be shared with the clients, and this kind of helps you support the decision of not using an antimicrobial. So if a client understand and signs this form, they do understand why you're not recommending antibiotics. So if you can read the form, it says like some cases of acute diarrhea, acute vomiting do not require antibiotics, and it's been only few days that it's happening. Also in red ink, it's mentioned that you have to tell the client when they should come back to you, because that is very important. If the infection does not if whatever the issue is, it's not solved within particular day, between 3 to 4 days, the client should visit you back. So that is very important to mention, and you can use this form. So remember that every prescription that you hand out will count. We have this wonderful Protect Me poster by Basawa, and it is a wonderful guide to maintaining or protecting antibiotics and following antibiotic stewardship in your own practice. You can print it, zoom it, and print it and stick it in your practice. You can follow. There are different systems that have been discussed. There is gastrointestinal system, respiratory system, skin, eye lesions, ear infections. So these are the things that are discussed. And there are different antibiotics that are mentioned. You can actually, according to your protocol, decide and check the antibiotics that you should be using in your practice, and you can advise your other colleagues in the practice to follow the same. So there is, you can maintain a protocol of deciding which antibiotics to use when. So you can go through it. There are scan codes available all throughout the poster. You can scan them and read it in detail. But it's very important also to follow the guidelines where it mentions you're not supposed to use an antibiotic. That is also mentioned in the poster. So please make use of this poster, and that's a way of antibiotic stewardship. Also, another important part is culture and sensitivity. So, when you're using unnecessary antibiotics, it can lead to development of antibiotic resistance. And culture and sensitivity is a key tool for antimicrobial stewardship. I have seen that there's an increase in the usage of this culture and sensitivity. A lot of vets are kind of sending samples out for culture and sensitivity, which is excellent to see. But it's very important how you send the sample and how to process the sample. So first of all, it should be an aseptic technique. You should try to prevent contamination as much as possible. Always use a sterile swab, whether it is a ear swab, whether it's a wound swab. The right sample is very important. We come across many urinary tract infections, but when you collect urine, either like a free catch or whether you put a urinary catheter, there's always a chance of contamination. So cystocentesis is the best way to collect a urine sample for culture and sensitivity. Proper transport is important. If the sample is exposed to heat or too much sunlight, it can be damaged. So maintain proper temperature. Last but not the least is clinical information. Very, very important. What you write on the piece of paper is very important. You have to mention a detailed clinical information about the patient. So this kind of can give a context to the whether you're sending a histopathology or culture and sensitivity. Very important to write the patient details, so the microbiologist or pathologist can kind of correlate the signs and understand the context of what that sample is, and it helps in interpretation of results. So if you make sure you follow this, you'll get a correct culture and sensitivity report. Again, in certain practices, or some people do follow mentioning what antibiotics they want to be tested against, which is a very good practice. So like we know, in humans, they already have started using very high antibiotics, and they might not even test for the lower antibiotics like amoxicillin or cephalexin sulfa drugs. So it's very important to mention the names of the antibiotics that you wish to test the sample for, and this can actually help you get a better uh, understanding of the results. Also, interpretation, it there are two methods. They do the zone inhibition, which gives you whether it's sensitive, intermediate, or resistant. Also something called as minimum inhibitory concentration. This is the lowest concentration of the antibiotic that inhibits the bacterial growth. So this can actually give you like a quantitative method of finding which is the most sensitive antibiotic. So lesser the minimum inhibitory concentration, lesser the MIC, more the antibiotic is sensitive towards the bacteria, and you can use it. So just an example of the report, and it tells you which antibiotics is resistant to. Also, you can, if you have a veterinary lab, you can mention what the doctors should use, what the vets should use, and always, like in this case, it's mentioned that you can start with amoxicillin clavulanate or cephalexin, and then maybe move towards higher in case it doesn't work, or reculture if required. So it's very important what you write in the culture and sensitivity report also. So we don't have much time, but like we just have two cases that we're going to discuss. One, say you get a case of deep pyoderma. The first thing that you do is, I mean, seeing the skin in such a bad condition, your first instinct is to advise antibiotics. And yes, you're not wrong, but yes, there will be a requirement of antibacterial. But first, you'll have to do some kind of a skin test, either cytology, you can do a skin scraping, you can do a biopsy, which gives you a clear idea. Even something like an impression smear and then doing gram staining will be very helpful. You can always get history. You can find out about the underlying cause, whether it is mange or whether it is food allergies, things like that. So you can find out. Always you will start with some topical washes. Use chlorhexidine, very good in controlling the bacteria, and very good antimicrobial. Supportive treatment is very important. Not only giving antibiotics will work, you'll have to support the immune system, you'll have to support the immunity of the skin. Systemic antibiotics, yes, you can start with first generation antibiotics, which is the amoxicillin or first generation cephalosporins. You'll always have to continue the antibiotic course till 2 or 4 days after the clinical signs have disappeared. Very important to ask for reviews, because usually when you prescribe a 7-day antibiotic, the owner might not come back. So very important to write that please review after 6 days, and explain to the owner that you might have to extend the antibiotic for a few more days. So now this is another wonderful chart by Vasawa, and they have this responsible treatment for canine pyoderma, and it gives you a flow chart of first to confirm whether it's pyoderma because of bacterial infection, then what you can follow, whether you can start with topical, whether you can do systemic antibiotics, when to do culture, and what treatment is to be given. So again, these kind of charts can really help you analyze the situation and not directly jump to higher antibiotics as your first choice. And there's another flow chart also. It's a similar chart which just tells you what is the process to be followed, like start with cytology and then further diagnostic tests, and then what treatment. So everywhere it does mention topical washes, which is very, very important. Whether you're giving systemic antibiotics or you're not giving, topical therapy is always something that you should start with. This is another article that you can refer, and this is by specifically by an organization working for dermatology. In our Protect Me poster, there is a section which is for skin infections. As you can see, it clearly mentions that antibiotics should not be used for something like Malassezia dermatitis. Now, that is where your cytology is going to help. As soon as you see budding yeast cells in under the microscope, you will at least try and control the Malassezia rather than just starting with antibiotics. So that is very important. And always for surface pyoderma, go for topical therapy. For superficial pyoderma, you can maybe give topical therapy, and if it doesn't resolve in a few days, you can switch to the first tier of antibiotics. So something that we want to talk about, I've already explained what selective pressure is, but this is an example because this is where most of us use antibiotics, is when there is skin infection. So just imagine you are kind of giving an antibiotic for skin infection, and there is a bacterial population in the intestines already, right? And when you're giving systemic when within the bowel lumen, there will be commensal organisms, and they will be both susceptible, and there'll be some resistant microbial strains. So now when you prescribe, say, a systemic antimicrobial to treat the skin infection, okay, it will reduce the bacteria which is susceptible, right, to whether it's in the skin, whether it's in intestine, the bacteria are going to die. These are the susceptible bacteria. But what happens following, when these susceptible bacteria are completely eliminated, there's selective pressure, and then the number of resistant bacteria are going to predominate. And overall, when you see the dog's skin, you will see excellent improvement. But what is happening inside in the gut is, there's going to be a transfer of genetic material, and there are going to be more resistant strains in your gut. So how do we reduce this? How do we stop this selective pressure? Is first, again, I emphasize on topical washes using chlorhexidine, or you can use shampoos which have antibacterial, antifungal effect. Treat the underlying cause. What if it is mange? What if it's flea allergic dermatitis and you're just giving antibiotics? It's not going to solve the issue. Use narrow spectrum, go for the first tier antibiotics, correct dosing interval, duration. Very important, nutritional deficiency. So you can always give omega oils, you can give some B complexes. Also very important, supplement good gut bacteria. So that is going to be your prebiotics, probiotics, which are going to help a lot. And completely avoid the use of the high priority critically antibiotics. We know by now is the third and fourth generation cephalosporins, fluoroquinolones, and macrolides. So this is the way that you can actually stop. And because we have been using antibiotics so much for skin infections, the most of the cases that we encounter with MRSA or MRSP are skin infections. So you have to be very careful. Second case, talking about non-hemorrhagic diarrhea and acute hemorrhagic diarrhea. So these both are similar in a way that the treatment scenario might not require antibiotics. So again, when we look into our Protect Me poster, the gastrointestinal infection, it clearly mentions when it's not indicated. That is, if there's acute vomiting, if there's acute diarrhea, if there is, just pancreatitis, things like that. So you have to, very important, like in skin infections, we take a cytology or we do any skin test. For any kind of diarrhea, it'll be very important to do a stool sample or fecal sample examination, find out if there are parasites, find out if there are giardia. So giardia will require fenbendazole for 5 days rather than antibiotics. So things like that. So you can really make good use of this poster. Again, we have a poster by Vasawa which gives you step by step how to treat acute diarrhea, whether it's mild, moderate, severe. In any case, there is a lot of loss of electrolytes and bicarb, so you'll have to replenish the fluids. You'll have to give fluid therapy, which is good enough. You don't have to immediately switch to antibiotics. So do a proper exam, give supportive therapy. Dietary correction is something that you can do, and you'll see immediate changes. Trickle feeding, very important. So ask the owner to feed in small quantities. Always provide fresh water, deworming if required, and you can use obviously other things like probiotics or kaolin pectins. And just a question, like what about metronidazole? Like in everybody's practice, as soon as you see a case with diarrhea, first thing you want to give is metronidazole. So what studies and trials suggest is that there's not much, when they had segregated these groups, and they found that there's not much difference in animals treated with metronidazole and animals treated with probiotic. Okay, the diarrhea, the length of diarrhea is not like shortened because of use of metronidazole. Dietary modifications and probiotics will be a much safer option. Why? Because metronidazole, specifically in cats, long term can cause a lot of neurological signs. And also they found that there is severe dysbiosis in the gut post metronidazole therapy, and this can last for 2 to 4 weeks. So we do get cases where immediately you treat with metronidazole and they'll come back saying, oh yeah, it's completely fine and the diarrhea is stopped, but again in a few days this thing starts again. Why? Because of dysbiosis. So always remember, don't immediately reach for metronidazole. Try to first correct it with probiotics, and if it is a very bad case of diarrhea, and it's a chronic diarrhea case, then you can obviously go for fluid therapy and try to give supportive medicine rather than starting with antimicrobials or antibiotics. Coming to the principles of use of antibiotics in surgery, because we are a high volume and high quality surgery place where we do it in WVS, and we usually routinely do a lot of spay neuter surgery. So when you can see that we have categorized the wounds or surgical wounds into clean incised wounds, there is clean contaminated and infected. So when you are having a clean incised wounds, like say you're doing a spay neuter routine surgery, elective surgery, you actually don't need antibiotics, right? And if you do it in a short enough time, you don't even have to give it before starting the surgery, like pre-operatively or peri-operatively, right? If there is some contamination, say some cases like pyometra, it may be required. Again, you can always the first thing that you're going to do is lavage the abdomen, and you can give the antibiotics for at least for 3 to 4 days after the surgery. Contaminated wounds, yes, for sure, you might require antibiotics, but again, the immediate thing that you should do is you should take time to lavage the wound or the abdomen, and then maybe put it on antibiotics. And whenever you have contaminated or infected wound, always try to get a sample when you're in there, either during surgery or when it's you're cleaning a wound. Always make sure that you send a sample. So at least if you start the first line and say you do get a bacteria that is very resistant or gram negative, you might have to shift to higher antibiotics, but that will give you some support in your making your decision. So antibiotics in surgery has to be used very carefully. Like I already discussed, we don't need it when you're doing spay neuter surgeries. If you also have it's a high volume clinic, and you see that post operative wound infections are common, so the permissible limit is 0 to 3.5%. But if routinely, if you do 100 surgeries and out of that 4 of them require post-op antibiotics, you'll have to stop, you'll have to go back and see what the actual problem is. whether there is some problem in your asepsis or whether there is some issue with the suture materials or scrubbing. Yeah, so when we talk about prophylactic use, it is only prior to surgery. This is the only place that you would have to use the antibiotics before surgery, right? Therapeutic antibiotics, obviously course will be, you'll have to document it, you'll have to diagnose the infection, right? And then you have to deal with it properly. And remember, very very important, and that is what we follow, antibiotics are not an alternative to maintaining asepsis during surgery. Just because you don't want to follow asepsis and you want to finish the surgery fast, you cannot depend that antibiotics are going to take care of the infection. If you don't maintain asepsis, there's no guarantee that antibiotics can also take care of the infection post-operatively. So very important, stage 1 is to maintain asepsis during surgery, and that can, in that way you can completely even avoid using antibiotics in elective surgeries. So these are some examples where we would not require antibiotics, like acute diarrhea, acute vomiting, uncomplicated upper respiratory tract, say something like kennel cough, right? Then chronic bronchitis in cats, which is asthma. Then FIC in cats. This is very common, and as soon as you feel there is cystitis, you pull up an antibiotic. So there are many causes for FIC, and you should maybe pay attention to the history and kind of find out more about cats in this case. Superficial wounds, again, lavaging the wound is very important. We have seen superficial wounds heal just with lavage and topical antibiotic therapy. Juvenile vaginitis and malassezia, we already discussed about that. Ectoparasitic diseases like mange or FADs. Routine uncomplicated dental cleanings, again, when you scale, you actually can just go ahead and do a chlorhexidine mouthwash before you start scaling, and you can apply an antiseptic gel after you do it, so you don't require post-op antibiotics if it's uncomplicated. Then eye surgeries, certain eye surgeries like cherry eye or ectropion, they don't need any antibiotic systemically. You can go for topical eye drops in these cases. And routine elective surgeries, like we've already spoken about, if it's a small mass, something like lipoma, and you don't have to go for post-op antibiotics if you maintain proper asepsis. So coming down to everything, we as veterinarians, we know the most important thing is client communication. It's how you communicate your thoughts to the client, and that's how you develop trust. So this is there's something called as get smart. So you can, first you have to gain trust of the owner. You have to empathize. You have to understand their condition. You have to take time to explain the condition. You have to share, like, it's just not done if you write the cytology report. Maybe talk to them about what you found, and sometimes they're interested in seeing pictures from the microscope, and they feel very interested. So you can do that. You can make specific diagnosis. You can articulate what's next. Very important, whether they should continue antibiotics, when they should stop, when there should be a review. Very very important. Resist unnecessary use when it's not required. Again, when you do this, you can always use the non-prescription form, antibiotic form, or you could just explain to the owner why you're not using it, and obviously treat with exactly what is required. There's no need to add antibiotics into every single infection or disease. You can always go for some other kind of topical therapies. So, like we said before, the initial part where you can stop antimicrobial resistance is preventing infections, right? So, how would you prevent an infection? First, talk about vaccination, regular vaccinations. In this way, there is a good immunity, and the dog develops a good immunity against various diseases. Maintain proper hygiene, proper nutrition, very important again for immunity and biosecurity. So we've all been through COVID, and we know how important that is. Just by not spreading the disease, you can actually avoid the use of antibiotics. So from me, the key takeaways and actions that are required is protect your vital antibiotics. Very very important for the future generation. Stewardship, obviously, try it and implement responsible practices. Use these posters, use these guidelines, use QR codes, just to let you so that you can be guided in your next step. Educate, inform the clients, not only clients, talk among colleagues whenever you have time, like discuss. And if there is obviously, if there is some discussion whether to use the antibiotic or no, you might be able to go back and look at some papers and then come to a decision whether antibiotics should be used or no. So education, very important. And last is collaborate. So we have to collaborate and work together. We all have to be a part of One Health and try and reduce the antimicrobial resistance. These are some of your online resources that you can look up, and there are some scan codes. We have our WVS Academy where there is a specific section for antibiotics, and you can go through this and make use of all these resources. Coming to the end, antibiotic resistance is a looming crisis, and it is going to take almost 10 million lives annually by 2050. So we have to be prepared for it, and the only way is to follow antibiotic stewardship and be really vigilant about antibiotic usage. So remember, the antibiotics you save today can save a life tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anita. That was super informative, and it's such an important topic. So thank you for explaining everything so clearly and going through those cases. That was really amazing. Thank you very, very much. And thank you everyone for watching. If you have any questions at all, please do pop it in the comments, and we'll discuss that now. Or if you have any questions afterwards, then you can get in contact as well. But yeah, whilst everyone's having a little think about a question, I would just quite like to ask one of my own. So I'd be really interested to hear, Anita, whether or not you've had a situation recently, or maybe not so recently, where you used to give antibiotics to a certain condition or to a certain case, and that would be your first thing you'd reach for, and whether now, with a bit more research and knowledge of that you can do things slightly differently, whether there is an example you could give us where you do things differently and you've had equally good outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Beth, for the question. So initially, a few years back, I would say almost 4 or 5 years back, I did realize something about treating skin infections, wherein I randomly started, seeing cases with culture and sensitivity reports showing MRSA and MRSP. So that was quite a shocker for me, because I had heard about this, but I hadn't seen it in my own practice. But when I saw it firsthand, that really kind of woke me up and kind of said that I should be a little more careful about using antibiotics in skin conditions. And almost it's been like 4 or 5 years that I've always preferred topical therapy for superficial pyodermas or general skin infection cases. And the most recent one, I would say, is cystitis in cats, and especially when it's idiopathic cystitis. And initially, when you think about urinary tract infections, it says infection, so you immediately prone to reach out for an antibiotic, and that is what I would do. And as soon as the owner says, oh, my cat is straining, there is like a drop of blood, or it smells bad, and I've started thinking about the antibiotic. But recently, when I've started asking them history and asking about, is there a stressful situation, is it only on a dry food diet, or is it something related to just is it been there before and it's happened again, these kind of things. So getting a proper history has actually helped me stick to something like just good painkillers, anti-inflammatories, or changing the diet, things like that. So this has equally helped cats suffering from FIC. So that is a lot. Even the feline lower urinary tract disease, when it's in the initial stages, it's really great to treat it with just painkillers and anti-inflammatory. The second thing I would do is also like try to get a free cat sample, at least to find out if it has true whites, or if it has any kind of crystals, and maybe then change the diet and things like that. And sometimes when it's true white and there are leukocytes, I would want to start with a first tier antibiotic, but not unless there is no other reason why the cat has struggling to urinate.
Yeah, I think that's such a brilliant example, and one that I've definitely had experience with in the last couple of years as well. And that that most cases of cat cystitis are sterile, and that we just don't need those antibiotics. And obviously there are cases where they are an infectious cause to them, but having that confirmed with actually doing a cystocentesis and a sterile urine sample and getting that confirmed via culture and sensitivity is so much nicer to know that you are then giving antibiotics for a proper infection rather than just kind of guessing a little bit. And obviously, having those cases resolved just with pain relief, increased hydration is so satisfying. It's so much research is coming out now in areas where we just don't need antibiotics as much as we thought we used to. So it's just great to keep on top of that, and having presentations like this just keeps us all at the forefront of that research. And I think one of the hardest parts of this is communicating with owners. So I just wondered whether you had any experience or any tips or tricks on just getting that across to owners, such a high level topic, and explaining that at an owner level and getting them to be on board with the fact that you're not going to use antibiotics in this case.
No, it's always a struggle. We still get owners and clients who have randomly started some antibiotic, and the worst part is, yes, a lot of vets do prescribe over telephone, and that has also been a very important part for this kind of spread of antibiotic resistance, because the owners kind of don't then go for actual for an actual clinical exam, and they just randomly can start antibiotics, and the duration again depends on their comfort, so they would just give it for 3 days or 5 days. And so every time now I get a case like that, I sit with them, I talk to them about resistance. I just, in clear terms, I just tell them that, okay, you're given this for 3 days, now next time if there's an infection, if I use the same antibiotic, it's not going to work. So if you're going to keep doing this, I will have to keep changing it, and it can have side effects on the dog. So when you kind of put it in that way, where you say something like side effects, or the dog's kidneys or livers, or kidney or liver is going to get damaged, they kind of take it a little more seriously. So you have to actually scare them about it. It is a matter of great concern, so you're not lying, but you'll have to tell them. But now I think small thanks to maybe Google and ChatGPT, and where people can immediately, as soon as I say resistance or culture, they immediately will Google and they'll find out. And the thing is, it tells you positive things. So they do understand why a culture is required. So they kind of will listen to your instructions. So I think it's a good help. And now some clients, there are, I think, about 70% clients that will understand, and there'll be 30 which will still prefer to use antibiotics how they are using.
There's definitely more and more education every day, and it's great to be going in that direction, and it just helps with us explaining and making it relatable, making it personal, and I think just taking time with clients really helps. So we're all in this together. Like you said in your presentation, we've all just got to work together for better antimicrobial stewardship, and hopefully we can make a real difference. I don't think there's any questions in the chat or the comment section, but if anyone does have any questions that they think of after the fact, then I'm sure Dr. Anita is probably happy to be contacted. We don't have her email on here, but I don't know whether you mind providing it, Dr. Anita, or otherwise you can contact us on our Instagram and our socials. We also, like Dr. Anita said, we have our Academy website, which has so much information on it. And we are building up this webinar series, which is on our YouTube. So please check out that, as well as lots of other little informative videos and educational videos. So please do follow for more. And we are going to be having an avian webinar series coming up in December. So look out for that as well. But thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Dr. Anita. That was incredible. And see you all very soon.
Bye.
Bye.